Redrider in the SCA. As far as the rest of the world, I am pretty active in horses, particularly carriage driving and that type of thing. So I would like it if you guys want to ask any questions, that you can do so as we go along. The journey for Horsehair is an interesting one, and it's one that I'm continuing to learn about as I go on. I was talking to a gentleman last weekend and learned a whole bunch of more new things. So this is not 100% complete because there are always new things to learn, but let me take you on our little journey. So this kind of talks about how fast horsehair grows. And there was a survey done in the Czech Republic. And unfortunately, I can't pronounce this correctly. So that's why I posted it up here so that you can read it. But they were analyzing horsehair that was found in a medieval stable. And we are now used to looking at hair in general to look at DNA and to know what things are happening. And with this particular study, they went back and looked at what these horses were eating. We don't know exactly how many horses were in the stable, but they had several samples, and they could tell what these horses were eating. And when they, because they looked at a large enough sample to look at 7 months, they could see whether they were out on the grass or whether they were getting fed barley or oats or hay, some version of hay. And then they also could see with the one horse that he was in the stable all the time, and he was always fed from the stable. And then they think that there was one also that was always outside. So these are things that we now look at in horsehair that we couldn't look at 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. So when you're researching these things, you have to kind of take into mind that technology has changed. What we may have believed in even 1980 may not be true now because of digs and things like that, that we've learned more. And later this month, I do one on carriages, and there's this whole theory that got wiped out because of a dig in 1980, this whole discovery. So while we learn these things and we look at how horsehair can help us understand things, we can now look at horsehair that was used in making shirts and different things like that to know more about the animals, not just about the people and the culture and the way that they were using it as a material or a fabric, which really gets interesting. But there's not been a lot of research on that. It's just come along in the last few years. But one of the important things about this is it does tell you about how fast horse's hair grows. And ultimately, it's not very fast. 3 centimeters long, so it represents 1 month of hair growth. So when they are looking for ideal hair, they're looking for sections that are 4 to 5 feet long. And particularly when they were doing fishing line, they were really looking for very long sections. And it gets really interesting about how, so if you're trying to weave or do a lot of these things, you have to be at least 6 inches and then go from there. And if you have a question at any time, just feel free to ask. So who has the best hair? So horses that come from cold weather climates have thicker hair. Horses that don't get urine on their tail, such as a stallion or a gelding, has better tail hair. Horses that have white hair or the paler color hair, they have now, through analyzation, realized that they have stronger hair. So when you're looking at grades of hair, usually the white hair is used for, and they still, from these cold weather places like the stands, Mongolia, those type of places in Russia, they export a tremendous amount of horsehair still today. And you're kind of going, well, what do people do with it? It's violin strings, instrument strings in general. And so they're actually dividing these up into categories as to what type of hair you're buying. And you can go online and buy it in bulk. For the most part, it is from deceased horses, although like if you're doing it as a weaver, particularly in the United States, a lot of times you just find a friend that has a horse and you just clip some of it. Ideally, it's a cut hair. They don't really like to have the ends of the hair that was into the body because it is more likely to degrade faster. And so those are some things that we consider when we look at this. Horsehair in general, so we have the hair that's actually on the body of the horse, and that's nice and soft usually. It doesn't felt particularly well, but it can be felted and has been at times used to make bedding and pads to go under a bed, that type of thing. There's been some of those submitted from various A&S projects over the years for SCA. And as we were mentioning earlier, they tend to smell when you get them wet. So it's not always the perfect matting, but it is something that you can do. And a lot of times when people are thinking about their A&S projects, especially in equestrian, we get bogged down into how expensive it is. We get bogged down into barding and that type of thing. But when you're looking for things to do, don't rule out horsehair, because there are tons of projects that you can do. And if you have a horse, you can do it in pretty inexpensive ways. Right now, every horse that I know is shedding or has shedded out. And so you could make a pillow or a bed pad, something like that, very inexpensively. You can also make a variety of other things, because good horsehair holds up to 4 pounds of weight, which means that there are tons and tons of things that you can do with it. So if you really want to get interesting, you can build a wall with it. Instead of lime and gypsum, there was a point at which they mixed clay and dug, I think, horse dung, but I've not seen anything that said that you couldn't use other types, with horsehair, and use that to plaster walls. And the horsehair kind of acts as a binder for it. And that is horsehair that is cheap and not high quality horsehair. Some horsehair is brittle, and that's when we go back to what they were looking at when wet horses eat. You want a nice soft horsehair. You can use for this horsehair as a binder most types of horsehair. It doesn't have to be just mane or tail hair. When we talk about fishing line, though, we are talking about tail hair. Very hard to get a fishing line out of a mane, because it's just not long enough. Now, I have one horse that has had a natural mane for probably 20 years now, and it really just still isn't long enough. There's not enough there. I've used his tail hair for lots of other things, and that's great. But in general, the mane hair is a little softer. His tends to be a little wavier. It's also dark, and it just doesn't work as well. You can use them for surgery.
Question real quick.
Sure.
Did we have an idea, like for a lot of things, there would be guilds to cover, like, if I was going to make leather, there's a tanner's guild, that, and that's how they kept track of stuff. Was there, this seems to be a process of sorting, and there's different qualities, and it's fairly intricate. Do we have an idea? Like, I think medieval people were smart people. They figured out a lot of what we're talking. They just didn't use our methodology to figure it out the same way.
So as far as I know, the guilds and that type of thing didn't come along until later, after SCA time. And then it got incorporated into textile. Really, after 1700, they really start using horsehair as a textile and really sorting it out into various things. Prior to that, a lot of people had access to horsehair, and it was just one of those things that you could use that was available to not necessarily everyone, but a lot of people. And you can, just as you use horsehair, you can also use ox hair, cow hair, camel hair, that type of thing. It's very, there are examples of cow hair that has been used to make the sleeves and some shirts and things like that. The amount of time that whoever, and I assume it's women, that these women must have put into it is incredible, because it's just not very long. You know, I mean, and I know that there are various types of cattle that have longer hair, but there's just nothing that gets in a cattle range that gets horsehair the same length. There's nothing that gets 4 or 5 feet. So really, we don't, to answer your question, we don't see a lot of guild type stuff until, and being recognized as a trade until after SCA period.
But we kind of have an idea that, I mean, common sense sort of dictates that people, they understood the mane and tail hair is better than the body hair, and it has a better use for this purposes, that they would have certainly have a commodity which has some utility to it that other things do not. Therefore, I can get more for that than this.
Yes, and it's hard. It's so hard with horsehair because it decays. So some things, some in general, it's a little bit more wealthier side of things that have survived. So, but we know that, and I just forgot the date on the fishing, but I think it's 1646, something like that. That's when some of the first fishing books were written, and they talk about it. We know in Japan they had examples that were very, very early. We know that they used it for surgery because in most cases the body won't reject it. And up until like the 1970s, they still used it for surgery in the United States. They used it if you had a facelift or something, they would go in with horsehair. They used it for armor, clothing. They even used it for games, which I just learned that this past week. And so we're going to take a look at some of these things. Now, I did the fishing line. This was one of my COVID-19 projects. And I went in and we did pull a lot of horsehair. And we have 5 different horses. So I have hair from 5 different horses. And it's very easy once you start feeling this, which it's, I mean, I know it's harder when you're on the computer and it's not an SAA event. It's very easy to tell which horse is which, which you wouldn't think that would be true, but we have a blue roan, we have 2 blue roans, and this hair ends up in a color mix. And then we have a palomino, who gives us more of a white color. I have a dark bay, and so I get a reddish brown color here. And so for this, we did choose the palomino hair. My mom was a great holder of the other end. So we chose hair that we had cut previously. And that may or may not have been a mistake because it was a little bit more dried out. One of the things that you have to do is try it, and you don't want to put enough pressure on it to break it. But if it's going to break when you're sorting the hair out, you want it to break then, and not after you get, you know, half a foot done. So you do test it for strength and just kind of see, you take the individual hairs and test it. And a lot of them broke. We think that that was because we had cut this hair at, let's say, Christmas, and I didn't use it until March. Now this hair here we've cut since, and it seems much more pliable. You can put it into water if it's really stiff, and that will help as well. But you really are checking it to see if it's going to break. We then work through this process, and it's basically, I'm not a nail binder. I don't do nail binding, but my understanding is this is a very similar process. And then the thing that I had the hardest time with is understanding how to add in hair. And there are a couple of different options. You can do it like you do with some other things, and like add it in side by side. It's a little hard to see, I'm sorry. and go like this and keep going. I also read about a method, which is the one that I used, which is here on the right. Yeah, it's on the right. And you put the two pieces, you take, this is my piece that I'm running out of. You take it and you fold it in half and bring it up. And then you slide the new one through it. And you're going to say, well, that gives you more. Yes, it does. Because as you go down, you're going to need a little bit more strength of the, so you end up with the very complex set of strings by the time you get to the end of this fishing line. However, it does not want to break. And you can put a lot of pressure on this and it won't want to break because you're doubling it. And so we figured by the time I got done, I could possibly take up to about a 15-pound fish. We're waiting for the free fishing day so that we can go try it. We don't really fish, so we then also spent some time looking at what type of hook they would have used. And for most cases, by this time, they had metal hooks. But if you don't have a metal hook, you can use the thorn. And we did debate as to just how sharp a thorn would have to be and how small and that type of thing to fit into the mouth of a 15-pound fish. And ultimately, we decided that we, as non-fishermen, really didn't know the answer to that. So we will have to experiment on that as soon as we find a free fishing day. The lovely thing about this COVID-19 project is that we do get to have time to do these type of projects. The bad thing is that we couldn't go out on a fishing day. The state park was closed. This is an exhibit that I was able to see when I was up in Flaming Griffin last year. And you look at it and you think, what does this have to do with horsehair? And this goes into the armor and that type of thing. They did use definitely horsehair to do different armor. In this particular case, it is particularly in the face and the helmet area in particular. I'm going to move this just a little bit, so hopefully nothing goes wrong. Oop, that's what I was afraid of. All right, so we'll just leave that there and I will read it off the other piece. Okay, so this is, the helmet is 1336 to 1573 series, circa, and it's one of the celebrated armor makers of the period. And it has a ridged helmet, and the bowl is made of 62 iron plates that are riveted together, the overlap of which creates a distinctive ridge. And there's some armor in it, but theirs is definitely has horsehair in it. I talked to some of the people at the museum, and it's largely in the face. The mustache and the hair on the lip is definitely horsehair, and then there is also, they believe, horsehair. There's animal hair, and they think it's horsehair in various places throughout this, but it's not used extensively throughout the whole armor. It's more like if they had to stitch something together and they fixed it that way. This is an example of how you stitch with horsehair. I thought that I was going to have to braid it or do something like that to stitch with it. And it turned out that I didn't. This is my project that I was working on before COVID-19 happened, which is horse collars. And I'm very interested in what they use to stuff horse collars. And that brought me to horsehair, because then along with straw, grass, and wood shavings and various other things, they did use horsehair in this. And this is one of those things where it would have been extra horsehair. When you were grooming your horse or whatever, you would have left, whatever you had left on the brush, you would have used it in here. And you can see the stitching there, but we also have it here. And this has held up really well. This has gone to 4 different states now. And I thought that it would break. I really did. And it hasn't. I have been extremely pleasantly surprised about that, because this little horse collar is stuffed full of grass, and I've been very worried about it coming out. But it has not even suggested that it would, and that has been really a wonderful thing. So if you have a project that you find that you think that you might need some horsehair, it's certainly a doable thing. The biggest thing for me, not being a sewer, was tying it off. And I think for that, you do need some hair with some oil in it, a fresher hair, rather than something, like I said before, was dried. This was maybe 30 days old when I stitched this. And you can tell I can't stitch very well, but it did knot well, and the knot has not come undone. So that was great. Now, we were just talking about the different helmets. So in general, horsehair and horsetails were tied into masculinity and being a good fighter and all those type of things. In the Middle Ages, if you really wanted to insult somebody, you would mess with their horse's tail. And so if a messenger came and he had bad news, not only would you possibly kill the messenger, but you would take his horse's tail. And that was considered a huge, huge issue. And it was very, very insulting, and there were small battles fought about that. And it's very easy to research that one if you're interested in battles and things like that. It's quite easy to find the research on that. You were mentioning earlier that you had done your helm, or the padding in your helm, with horsehair, and you can definitely do that. One of the things that I've learned, because I'm in carriage driving, is that it works best if you curl it if you want to have the padding. So in carriage driving, and when we make carriage seats up until the 1900s, they would actually curl the black hair, and that would help give it the spring, and then you would put it into the seat in a way that helps with the padding, and it lasts a long time. And it does give you enough protection. You know, you can imagine they would do this on a carriage seat, and it would last a long time. It's hard to say exactly how long it lasts because there's so many factors, but there's indications that it'll last an easy 50 years if you do it correctly. I'm not so sure about the helm padding and some things like that, because again, it depends on how much wear and tear it is. When you put sweat with horsehair, it's going to degrade faster because that's what nature intended it to do. So you do have to consider that if you're going to use it for padding in a military type setting, a fighting type setting. But if you're going to use it in something like a seat cushion, again, if you curl it, pack it in there enough that it has a little bit of spring to it, and then you put a line of linen or cotton batting in there so that it doesn't poke through and poke you when you sit on it, because that would be very uncomfortable. Which brings us to the problem of hair shirts. Hair shirts were apparently quite the thing at one point in time, and they were very uncomfortable. They're very itchy, but they made you remember your sins and how mortal you were, etc. And so it was not unusual for people to have hair shirts at one point in time. They also much more commonly had horsehair gloves and things like that, because horsehair is somewhat water repellent. They would use them for fishing. As you get up into the cold weather areas of the world, they would use them for that, and they could grab a hold, go ice fishing or whatever, grab a hold of a fish and not get their fingers wet, but also have some protection from whatever might be happening with that fish. They also use them in various places as socks and things like that, but I can't imagine that they're surviving examples, but I would think that that's very, very uncomfortable, and personally would not be my thing to do. Oh, I did want to say, I didn't get to talk to this fighter, so I'm not sure if this entire thing is made out of horsehair, but we do use horsehair for sleigh bells. It plumes over them. And what we know from that, this is pretty short, but if the farther up it gets, as time goes on, it will fall over. And that is considered non-attractive and not something that you want to have happen. So with the sleigh bells and with other things, they would often replace that on a semi-regular basis so that they wouldn't have to be seen as weak, because apparently when your horsehair is stiff, it's a sign of masculinity. All right, so we have this horsehair woven tasseled belt band that was found in Ireland, and it's supposed to represent from the Bronze Age. And this is one of those times where you can really see a lot of detail in it. They did find several pieces of it, and there is a lovely article from the Textile Society of America that you can get at Digital Commons at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For whatever reason, it does not have photos with it, but if you go to if you just Google it for Ireland horsehair tablet, it'll pop right up for these. They're in a museum. So it goes together. I believe it's the University of Cork that worked on these. But this is a great way to learn some more about what the things that they were doing in the later Bronze Age. And if you are into warps and wefts and things like that, which to be honest is not my thing, there is a lot of detail in here about this and about being a tabby weave and some very much more technical things than what I normally deal with. They do talk a little bit in this paper about basically that during this point in time, it may have been partially a part of horsehair would have been part of everyday life, and that it depended really on where you were at the time. It is only in the later times of the first metal using societies, the Bronze Age, that horses were ridden and used to pull carts and chariots. The domestication of the horse seems to have taken place around 4000 BC. And there's some evidence of that changing and things like that, but in general, this is pretty tight. In Ireland, they see evidence of domesticated horses from 3,500 years ago. So, you know, this fits right into our time period that we're talking about. And it talks a lot about how horses were important to the economy in a way that cows and sheep were not necessarily. But horsehair was a prestigious raw material associated with the wealthy and powerful people. From the evidence of horse bones in Ireland at that time, we can see that horses were widely distributed, but represent only 5% of funeral remains. This would suggest a widespread but sparse access consistent with the limited use of expensive and recently introduced animals. So that's what they're talking about there. There's quite a bit about some of these finds with where these women in particular were buried with horses, and that their trappings in particular have a lot of tassels, horsehair tassels, and belts. So that's, if you're really interested in the late Bronze Age from Ireland, it's a really great article. Again, that's from the Textile Society of America. It was from 1998, which again, some things have changed since then. Digital Commons at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Elizabeth Hackett was the author of that. Now, this is one that I have just recently learned about, and these are throwing balls. They use these as a game in Ireland, and there are 14 of them that were recently displayed in a museum, and they have horsehair in them. They are horsehair and jute wrapped, and apparently ball hurdling is quite the thing there. Unfortunately, I don't know a lot about the game, but it seems that it's still popular. And so it may be something that if you're trying to introduce a new game into your local events, this may be something to take a look at. This is again from Ireland, but that is horsehair in the middle. And you can kind of see it literally in the three balls in the middle, where the jute has come apart. And it's essentially felted horsehair. But and I would imagine that this is body hair, it's not mane or tail hair. I thought this was really cool thing to find. So at this point, we know that we can use horsehair for games. We can use it for clothing, and we can use it to get food and those type of things. And so what about all these other things that we sometimes see, which is often these sieves? Horsehair sieves like this today are still made. They can be used to I forgot the word, shift flour, different things. And if you use up to like 8 layers of them, they sometimes were used to press meat through and things like that. There is only one place in the world that makes this stuff in mass anymore. The rest of it is all done by hand in small businesses and things like that, and they're more of a weaver type situation. We used to use this quite a bit. Nowadays, I think the Shakers were probably some of the last people to use them here in the United States in mass. You know, those type of things, and to make them. The same procedure really that you use to make the sieve as far as making the horsehair into a textile is the same system that we use sometimes in carriages to make the back seats. And because that's the world that I'm in, I was able to talk to a couple of gentlemen about some horsehair seats they had used, because while I know that there are people that collect these sieves, I don't really get to handle one and touch one because the horsehair ones are pretty expensive. Whereas with carriages, like I know those people and I can touch it and no problem. It's very, very stiff. And when you sit or touch it, sometimes it will crackle. And that's how you know that it's supposed to be good, is that it will crackle when you touch it. But it's not supposed to break. And it can become very, very stiff, which is why it was used in the corner of pillows and things like that. And it will also give you a flat surface. This here, those of you that are into weaving would understand the width and the weights of it, but it takes a tremendous amount of time to make these. And again, you're looking at length, because to do this now, you do have to card out the hair. I'm not sure that necessarily it was carded and done all that type of processing back in the day. I think you just kind of went with it. But now they do use the cards and fluff everything out and pull out all the oils and things like that, and really card it before it goes in. And the pictures of the company that I've seen in England that does it, they still do that by hand. It is not something that is done by machine. The thing that is done by machine is the actual weaving. And it's getting harder and harder to get replacement parts for them. My understanding is also that if you're doing this by hand, you really, like a curved needle kind of helps, but it's very, very fine work. and it takes a long time to do a very small section. So that kind of wraps up my knowledge of horsehair and where I'm at now. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have and talk about anything. As you can tell, I'm not necessarily a person that has textile experience. So I can't speak to the left and weight of things. Catherine, did you have a question? Oh, unfortunately, I can't hear you. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to unmute you. No, I can't hear you.
He's not muted.
Okay.
You hear me now?
Oh, I can hear. Well, I heard you.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Yes.
Okay, apparently
We could be like a Verizon
okay,
commercial.
I had my headset on. And it's not mic'd, but apparently it was keeping me from using my microphone. I was just going to ask if you could give us the name of the supplier in England that still makes the woven horsehair cloth.
Sure. Hold on just one moment. Let me get that for you.
That would be really helpful. Also, another type of clothing that you might be interested in that was done with horsehair in various parts of the Middle East at different points where you would have a full face veil. You would have a piece that tied kind of around the forehead and came down over the eyes. That was made out of that same horsehair mesh that you see on sieves, because it would give you something that you could see through but be somewhat opaque to anybody else.
Is that a so would that act as like a, would that be form fit? Not, it's not form fitting.
No,
Is
no,
it stiff? Is it stiff or is it soft?
It was apparently, from what I've read, it was pretty stiff.
Okay.
So it like this wasn't like this was actually like a separate piece that would be like worn just over the eyes, and then you have fabric, other fabrics that were used to cover the hair and so on.
Okay. I have to say, I also, not that this is related to that, but I thought before, if you, sometimes where we are, like when I was in Spain, there was a lot of flies. And I thought that if I made it like a fencer's mask, it would keep out that type of thing too, which would be nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. John Boyd Textile. They are in England, and they are one of the last companies in the world that still does it.
It's
and
John Boyd,
B-O-Y-D. And it's
B-O-Y. Okay.
Their website is John Boyd Textiles.co.uk.
Okay.
And they've been doing this since 1837. And they said that in their area, I think they've been, their town has been doing it since early 1700s.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's amazingly expensive. Holy cow, is it expensive?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah. But if nothing else, they have some great videos on how and pictures on how they go through and do this. And unfortunately, it's after the SCA period, but the equipment that they use is really quite interesting. But yeah, have you made anything with horsehair?
No, I haven't. It's something that I'm interested in, and I have a friend, actually my Laurel, has a horse, so I have access to some horsehair, body hair more than mane and tail hair. Unfortunately, I'm in Eatonville, which is mundanely Arizona, You know, apparently we won't get like the first quality hair.
Yeah. So,
I was more interested in doing like body hair for stuffing, and you can get a lot of that when the horse sheds.
Do read through and decide whether or not you want to wash it and
Yeah,
things like that.
I think that I'm probably going to try washing it.
Yeah.
You know, to get just some of the matter out, and you know, trying to descent it a little bit. I mean, there really isn't anything that you can use for natural padding that won't give you some kind of a smell if it gets wet.
Yeah. Do not use Dawn on it because it will take all the oil out of it.
Yeah.
And it becomes more brittle. At least that's what I found with the tail hair. I'm not so sure about the body hair, but in general, I don't think you want to do that. And I do think you're going to want to card it.
Yeah.
And such.
I do a little bit of spinning, so I've got all the equipment for that.
I have talked to one person who spun it. He did it for his I believe it was for his daughter, because the horse was getting older, that type of thing, and he spun it, and then they made a stuffed horse out of it. And it was an act of love. I understand that there were many power words used in the making of it. So yeah, good luck with that, though. It should be a fun project if you get to do it.
Yeah, I think so.
Great. So does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah. Have you tried any of like there's mane and tail conditioner that's an actual product for using on the horse's mane and tail. You know, it helps to keep it from drying out like you're talking. Have you done any of that either while it's still on or after and seen if that made a difference?
My understanding is that you can use the conditioner on some of it. We don't use a lot of it on our horses. They are turned out a lot, and for better or worse, everybody that we have is getting a little older. Our minis, though, came from Minnesota, and they always have a very strong coat. And their hair is different than the others. You can wash it. When I say that, the mane and tail, you can wash it in the conditioner, and it's supposed to help if it gets too dry. But I don't know that you want to leave it on. I don't think I would use a leave-on conditioner. They do, like if you're using it to make like a basket or something like that, seem to like it to be a shinier color, and I think that those are often using conditioner because they don't want any fraying in it.
Okay.
But they definitely didn't back in the day, but now we want it to last longer than 2 seasons or something.
Well, I know that we use certain things like if I was going to make a sword scabbard and I line it with fleece on the inside, I'm doing it because the lanolin, the natural lanolin that's in the fleece, is going to help preserve my sword blade.
Yes.
But, it's like me oiling it when I put it in and out of the scabbard, and that has a very function. But I know that horses don't tend to have that much. They're not going to have that much moisture, the equivalent of lanolin in their mane and tail hair, like a sheep would.
Absolutely, and that's where when we collected it and we let it sit, we think it dried out. The stuff that I use now, but that was one of the things. I mean, when you put a lot of work into these things, and you took care of them, but you weren't making them with the idea that they were going to last 50 years because most things just didn't last that long back then. They were exposed to the elements more.
And let's be honest, if you were wealthy enough to have several horses or access to have the raw materials to work with, you're probably having somebody else do it. It's not the lord of the manor that's doing all the work themselves anyway.
Absolutely. Right. And it's it was often women's work, and I think that that kind of ties into today, where we keep horse tails and things like that as memorance. We make the bracelets and the different things like that. I think that kind of has gone through, but it really was something that, the fishing line and things like that, you could make that on, it took us a little while the first time, but the second time it didn't. And you could make that in 20 minutes or so. But you weren't expecting that to last a lifetime. You were hoping that you could catch a dozen or two fish with it. And if you were lucky,
and go on.
Yeah, you wanted dinner and that's what you did. The stitching, I think if you had bad hair, you would really have a problem with the stitching. And I don't understand how people used to make horsehair shirts. I mean, I look at them and I think that I don't, that's not something that I want to undertake. But because they are pokey.
To me, it's not got enough barbs in the hair for it to, the same reason it doesn't gnaw would mean it doesn't weave great either.
Right.
And I was looking at the, from the drawing that you had on the Irish, what's maybe a belt or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a chevron twill in the material.
It does. It's yeah.
Which means it's not tabby woven, or is it just a base twill? It's a more advanced pattern than that, and that tends to mean that somebody had to have more expertise to do that, and it's less of a used throwaway piece. It's a better status piece.
Absolutely. And not only that, but it survived. And so it was taken care of when it was made. Whether it was made as a funeral piece or not, we don't really know, but it gives us an indication of what was happening. It's, I want to say herringbone weave. I'm not sure if that's quite right. But it's a very,
I mean, it's a basic twill, but it's done in a chevron pattern. It's just a repeating pattern.
Yes. But it's tight. It's very, very tight. I don't think I have this right here, but here it is. The delicacy and fine workmanship of the piece is outstanding. The impression is given some type of an insignia or ornamentation. It would be possible to be sewn into this band into a necklace, or worn decoratively on a cloak or a tunic, or attached to some object. So whoever made this had some skill. And because as we were discussing, it's not an easy thing to do. But they also,
not something a peasant would be wearing around.
No. But it would have resisted water well. It would have been, horsehair in and of itself is fairly fire resistant. It's fire retardant, which is the reason why they used it in sleigh robes on your feet, or that went over your feet, was because you could have the warming blocks underneath it and it wouldn't catch on fire. So it would have been something that as a piece of material, although it's got to be scratchy. I just can't imagine that it's not. It's going to keep you somewhat dry, and it's going to keep you somewhat fireproof, which I would imagine is still an issue during this time period, because you're still trying to stay warm, So
yeah, but a lot of it's going to depend on what you're used to, and what you're doing. Like I mostly wear wool tunics all throughout the summer at Penzic, so all wool is not the same. There's some that's finer. There's tropical weights. So there's all sorts of different variances of the fabric, but it's what you get used to. Like our army used to wear all wool socks, and when I went in, that was the standard. So I got used to wearing wool socks, and they don't bother me. But some people, like, I can't wear them. So it would depend on what you're used to, I think, a lot.
Well, and if you can, we now look at horses as companion animals. Back then, people may have had a favorite horse or something, but the reality is that most of them didn't live a long life, and that they were used for when they died, they used all the parts. And so these may have been very well made with very long horsehair, because they would have cut the tail off, or cut it directly off the tail. And so you would have had very long pieces too, again, and that would have helped make it less itchy, I think. Whereas the horsehair shirts that they made, those were made to be something that you thought about your discomfort when you wore one.
The whole purpose of it is to make yourself uncomfortable.
Yeah. Whereas with this, I don't think that was the purpose. I think this is a much different type of material, or quality and things like that. Unfortunately, that's when we talk about horsehair, we usually think of the hair shirts, and but it's such a cool thing, and I really wish more people would do research on it, because it's really starting to, not going to say it's starting, but more people have been looking at it because of the DNA things that we can learn from it. But there's so many high quality things that were made out of it, out of horsehair, that it's incredibly hard to find in museums. But when you actually are in a museum and you're looking at it, it's just classified as hair. But if you go back and you look, and
like you were talking about technology coming a long way, and it's given us further information, and it kind of revisits what we thought about things even from 10 years ago. But a lot of, like, if it was in the 1860s, 1880s, early 1900s, there's a whole lot of stuff. If you're looking for, I want to know if it's linen, is it jute, is it thistle, because there's fabric made from thistle.
yes,
It's kind of like guess, or said it's a linen, that doesn't mean it's necessarily linen. It means that they're thinking of linen as being, it's a textile, not necessarily as in from the flax plant or whatever.
yes, and
That stuff is,
as a technology person, you can probably appreciate the metadata. You could, at the end of the day, it's the metadata that makes it work, and how they looked at things then and how we look at things now are just so different. And how I originally got on this path was looking at fiber. There are horse collars that are made entirely out of plant fiber, and sedge and things like that, and Spanish moss and different things. And that's kind of how I started on this path, is because I was looking at wisps, which are made out of grass, and then that led me to the sedge collars, which then made me start making these collars, trying to, and they used to be stuffed with horsehair at times. And so it's this long path of SCA A&S projects.
I think if you keep looking, I think you'll find more stuff that's existed all along. It's just, it wasn't important, or it wasn't the big thing at the time to the person who was finding it and cataloging it. So they kind of, it gets put in the background.
That's definitely true with these balls. And I think that they may be something that I do next year, because I think they would be a lot of fun. And basically all they are is horsehair and jute. And
and I'm sitting there thinking, in comparison with what we think is a modern ball,
mm-hmm.
These are going to be pretty light.
They are. Actually,
because I was thinking about, like, you got me thinking, it's like, well, I'm going to have to make one of these just to see, do I need to put a rock in the middle to give it enough weight to?
Yeah. So this is somehow connected to the Cork Public Museum. And this actually only came around, the first one was discovered in 1910, and the most recent one was in 2010, but they never really did anything with them as far as like an exhibit or figuring out really what they were until we get into the 2013 area. And they have found them all over the country in Ireland. Well, I shouldn't say that, because it does say we haven't found examples all over. They found a lot of them, and they know that they're 400 to 800 years old, and some of them are even older. So, like, how could you not think that that would be fun?
Well, people are people. back then or now, everybody played with toys. Our toys are different, and we just have more access to technology. We're not really that smarter. If we go by, like, this was something I was looking at, the cubic centimeter capacity of the cavity that your brain goes in has not changed for the last 30,000 years, give or take. It stayed within the same range, which means our brains aren't bigger. Technically, we're probably not smarter. We just have more access to information and retain it more over the long haul.
Absolutely. And through events like this, you get to share it much easier because, as you were saying earlier, you know, you're, I think, in Ohio, and I'm in Kentucky, and there would be a possibility that we would meet, but the probability is very slim, and therefore you wouldn't share that knowledge.
It would have to be a big thing. You'd have to have a purpose, and, you know, for the most part, and people just didn't have that time to devote to stuff like that, I don't think.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Before we go, does anybody else have a question? And if you have any questions about horsehair or anything pretty much related to horses, I'm on Facebook. It's Kathleen Hake, and I'm pretty active on the SCA Equestrian page if you need to find me. But I'm working right now on a project. I am documenting my project. We just made some Icelandic inspired snowshoes for the horses, and so
Cool.
I thought it was going to snow when I made them, and we didn't get enough. We just got a late frost, so we haven't been able to truly try them. But we just made those too. So no cost involved, just hair and grass, and sticks.
Did you use like willow for the base? Did you make a form and then?
Well, so we made a. It depends on what period you look at, because we used snowshoes for horses up until 1929, roughly, and they still use them in Sweden and some other places. So we took some vines actually and used them to make shoes. We made them for the minis because I didn't have enough material to do a lot of them. Through my wisp experiment, I found that iris leaves and that type of a leaf is really, really strong, and that fiber is great. And if you let that die and kind of do its thing, and then you moisten it, it will bind like nobody's business. It really wants to stay together, and it's strong. And so I only had a small amount of that left from last year. It wasn't quite, nothing had grown yet when I did the project. And so we used that to bind them, to wrap the vines and make the shoe about 1.5 inches bigger than the horse's foot. And it would depend a little bit on what type of foot you have, because of a horse that has more of a fan to his foot, it would fit a little bit differently than the minis, because the minis are very upright. Their feet are very straight. But so we had to figure out how they attached them. We know that there's leather bindings, and we went back and looked. I have my dad used to be a farrier, and so we have like a bog shoe and some other things like that. And we looked at shoes throughout the ages and how they used them even in the Arctic experience, because there was a Arctic exploration that literally they probably died because they forgot their snowshoes for their ponies. They tried to send somebody back for them, and they died, and the whole bit. But we looked at their shoes and compared them to what they have found with the new Viking oriented things that have been found as the ice retreats right now, and looked at those bits and figured out the dimensions from there. But yeah, so because the minis are lighter, they don't need as much support. So they were using roots of trees, and when you decrease the weight to the weight of a mini, we feel pretty confident that the vines, the very thick vines that I used, will work. And then I have roots that I've been finding to make ones for the bigger horses when we have time. That was more than you wanted to know, wasn't it?
No, I'm interested in learning. If I can learn something, I'm happy.
Yeah, the big roots don't, it's hard to find with the big roots something that's small enough for the mini's feet that would bend in the shape. The bigger roots will, it's a bigger foot. And so, but the minis are
I'm sitting there
only,
thinking that a root enough give that you've got some resiliency, some elasticity, but it has a lot of durability with it as well.
yeah, which the vine does too, because we got some vine that's, a pretty good diameter.
When you say vine,
And
you're talking about like grapevine, that grows
yeah,
throughout.
as I
What I would
started this
call
conversation, I
grapevine.
thought, oh, I don't remember what the vine type of vine it is, but it's that type of a vine. And we got the end closest to the ground, so it's the thicker part, and use that. And but
Those
as
are
you
really
go,
strong. I mean, as a
it
kid, we
is.
used to cut them and swing on them.
Yeah. And when I was trying to pull it down the tree, it definitely did not want to break.
No.
I don't think, though, it would have been like as you go right out, I don't think it's going to be as good of a snowshoe as it would be if you were using a harder, for bigger horse. You have to go out for weight. But I think as far as an example for what a small horse could be used, I think they're fantastic. So.
Yeah, but depending on where in the world you were at, like, okay, like if I'm using turn shoes now, well, we're walking around concrete and asphalt for the most part. And your shoes didn't have that kind of wear and tear during the medieval period because most of that stuff didn't exist. It's like abrasives that every time you take a step, it's sandpapering off some of your sole.
Absolutely.
And they don't last long.
Right. And we've only found a few Viking era snowshoes for horses. I mean, we don't have a lot of them. So the question is the examples that we see, those people died on the trail or, something like that. So did those work or did they not work? We don't know.
Example of the guy who made something up and it didn't work and it led to his death, and we're trying to use it thinking that this is a good exemplar.
Yes. So that's why, we know later that these other shoes that were very similar were used in the Arctic exhibitions, and they're not a lot dissimilar. So you can take that and extrapolate out the some of those ideas, and then look at what the Viking era shoe looks like and say, okay, this is kind of what happened. And then, up even into World War II, they were still making these, and the military figured out how to make them, particularly in Russia and in some places like that, because they were still using them in World War I and World War II. And so there's this huge event in Sweden, in Norway type thing, where it's a trade event. And so they go on these long pilgrimage with the horses and everything, and they do use the snowshoes. So I found a guy that I can talk to that can tell me like how his shoes stay on, because that's the biggest thing. And the horses learn very quickly how not to step on them. And then you look at shoes that they used with the stagecoaches and different things like that, and really extrapolate out from there as to, what might have worked best. And then, we do still find bog shoes, which they use in marshy areas and things like that. So anyways, that's my next project. So. Well, I thank everybody for coming. Gail and Deborah have hung in there with us through this conversation. And I hope that you found it interesting and something that you can use. And again, if you have any questions about it, you can tag me on one of the equestrian event pages, SCA Equestrian, or you can find me on Facebook. I won't tell you my email because it's really long, but thank you so much for coming today.
I appreciate it. You guys have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.